The silence of the observatory was a familiar cloak, heavy and comforting. For years, it had been my constant companion, a presence more steadfast than any human. Here, nestled within the sprawling, forgotten acres of the family estate in region not on standard maps, the ancient walls absorbed the world's clamor, leaving me with only the distant hum of my instruments and the vast, indifferent expanse of the cosmos. Night after night I sat, a sentinel against the velvet black, sifting through the whispers of dying stars and the echoes of primordial dust. My life was a precise calibration, a deliberate rhythm honed by solitude and obsession. The air always carried a faint tang of ozone and old electronics, a scent that was uniquely mine. I'd power up the main console, watch the screens flicker to life, their pale light casting an anemic glow across the worn surfaces of my workspace. The deep space array, a colossal dish hidden by the estate's highest hills, would begin its slow, almost imperceptible sweep, its sensors listening to the universe with impatience I could only aspire to. My work was meticulous, a series of repetitive, intricate tasks. I logged the data streams, monitored cosmic background radiation, and charted the faint signatures of distant quasars. There was a quiet satisfaction in this process, in the slow accumulation of understanding, even if it was just a fraction of a fraction. The universe, I believed, was a grand, complex mechanism, governed by elegant, immutable laws. My role was simply to listen, to decipher. One particular night, the wind howled outside, a mournful dirge that rattled the observatory's aging dome. I barely registered it, my gaze fixed on the spectral analysis display. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the shifting patterns on the screen and the occasional clink of my ceramic mug against the console. Then a flicker, a single aberrant spike in the otherwise predictable noise floor. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my eyes narrowing. It was fleeting, barely there, like a phantom limb in the data. A transient burst, perhaps. Solar flare interference, a distant gamma-ray burst that had just grazed my sensors. My mind, trained in the art of rationalization, immediately sought a mundane explanation. I ran a quick cross-reference with known astrophysical events. Nothing. The cosmic calendar was blank for that precise moment in that precise vector. I initiated a diagnostic sweep of the primary receiver, then the secondary. The system reported optimal performance, no anomalies, no degradation. I recalibrated the filters, adjusted the gain, isolating the frequency band where the blip had appeared. The screen remained stubbornly clean, displaying only the familiar undulating lines of background cosmic hiss. I sighed, running a hand through my thinning hair, fatigue perhaps, my eyes playing tricks on me in the pale light. The hours passed. The wind outside quieted, replaced by a soft, insistent patter of rain against the dome. I was about to begin the shutdown sequence when it happened again. Not a blip this time. A sustained pulse, faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. It appeared in the exact same frequency band, from the exact same celestial coordinates. My fingers froze on the keyboard. This was not random. This was not interference. My heart began to thrum against my ribs, a low, steady beat that was suddenly too loud in the quiet room. I isolated the signal, stripping away the layers of cosmic static until only its faint, persistent signature remained. It was a rhythmic pulse, a repeating sequence of modulated energy. Not the chaotic burst of a supernova, nor the elegant, simple hum of a hydrogen cloud. This was different, too clean, too regular. My scientific curiosity, long accustomed to the universe's beautiful chaos, was beginning to prickle with something else. A nascent unease. I initiated a deep scan analysis, focusing all available processing power on this one singular event. The algorithms whirred, chewing through the data, searching for patterns, for known astrophysical fingerprints. The results scrolled across the screen, a series of probabilities and statistical deviations. None of them made sense. The signal didn't match any known natural phenomenon. Not a pulsar, not a magnetar, not a distant galactic core. It defied classification. The source, my calculations confirmed, was impossibly distant. A place where nothing should coalesce, let alone generate a structured signal. I spent the next several hours running permutations, cross-referencing, trying to break the signal down into its fundamental components. And that's when I saw it, the structure. It wasn't just a simple pulse. It was a complex series of nested patterns, a mathematical elegance that hinted at an intelligence so profound it was almost insulting to my own. A deliberate construction. It was like finding a perfectly cut diamond in the heart of an asteroid field, light years from any known civilization. My hands trembled slightly as I initiated the age calculation. The light travel time alone was staggering. The numbers glowed on the screen, stark and unforgiving. The signal had traveled for an epoch, for an inconceivable span of time. It had originated billions of years ago, before my own galaxy had even fully formed, before the first stars had truly coalesced into stable systems. It predated everything I understood about the universe's timeline, about the very emergence of complexity. This wasn't just groundbreaking, this was impossible. It violated the fundamental tenets of astrophysics, of logic itself. Who or what could have sent such a thing, and from such an impossibly ancient, desolate place? What was I listening to, and why had it chosen to speak now? The silence of the observatory, once a comforting blanket, now felt like a shroud. I had wrapped myself in it for days, perhaps weeks, the passage of time blurring into an indistinguishable haze. My world had shrunk to the glowing screens, the rhythmic hum of the servers, and the relentless, impossible pulse from the void. The family estate in region not on standard maps, with its sprawling, forgotten acres, had always been my sanctuary. Now it was a cage of my own making, an echo chamber for a signal that threatened to unravel me. I worked with a furious, almost manic energy, driven by a thirst for understanding that eclipsed every other need. My skin felt clammy, my hair matted, and the scent of stale coffee and ozone clung to my clothes like a second skin. The raw data streamed in, an unending flood of precisely modulated frequencies. My initial analysis had confirmed its artificial nature, but the deeper I delved, the more it defied every known scientific principle. I ran filtering algorithms, cross-referenced stellar catalogs, and even consulted obscure theories on quantum entanglement and superluminal communication, desperate for a terrestrial explanation. There was none. Yet here it was, perfectly coherent, perfectly structured, as if distance and the entropic decay of space were mere suggestions to it. I started with basic pattern recognition, feeding the data into custom-built algorithms designed to detect repetition, symmetry, and evolving sequences. What emerged on my primary display was not a random noise, nor a simple repeating beacon. It was a tapestry of astonishing complexity. There were nested patterns like fractals, where a small sequence, when magnified, revealed further intricate arrangements. Then those arrangements would combine to form larger, more elaborate structures, all without a single discernible error or deviation. It was too perfect, too precise. My fingers flew across the keyboard, calling up different visualization tools. I mapped the frequency shifts against temporal variations, the amplitude modulations against spatial coordinates. The signal wasn't just broadcasting, it was sculpting information with a mastery that made our most advanced computational systems seem like child's toys. It contained harmonic ratios that defied the natural resonances of any known material, and temporal signatures so precise they suggested a clock operating at an incomprehensibly stable rate, unaffected by the very fabric of spacetime. I found myself staring at a particular repeating motif, a series of 11 distinct pulses, each separated by an exact interval. But these weren't merely pulses. Each pulse itself contained a miniature, evolving sequence of sub-pulses. And the intervals between the main 11 were not uniform. They seemed to follow a progression, almost like a sentence being constructed. My mind raced, trying to force it into a linguistic framework I understood. Could it be a prime number sequence? A fundamental constant encoded? I tested every hypothesis, every known mathematical and physical series. Nothing fit. It was as if I was trying to read a book written in a language that predated the very concept of language, its grammar born from a logic entirely alien to my own. The air in the observatory felt heavy, charged. The hum of the machine seemed to deepen, to vibrate not just in the floorboards but in my very bones. My eyes burned, tracing the alien glyphs that formed on the screen, not actual glyphs, of course, but the visual representations of these impossible patterns. They began to feel less like data and more like a presence. A silent observer, communicating in a tongue I could only glimpse. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen, the smell of ozone sharp in my nostrils. The 11-pulse motif repeated, then shifted subtly, one of the sub-pulses changing its frequency ever so slightly. It wasn't a random shift. It was a response, like a word changing tense or a phrase adopting a new meaning based on context. But what context? And who was providing it? This wasn't merely a message. This was an active, dynamic exchange, a conversation being had with. What? Or was it waiting for me to respond? The implications were enormous, stretching my sanity thin. If this was a language, it was one that rewrote the very definition of communication. It operated on principles that bypassed our sensory perception, our linear understanding of time, our reliance on shared cultural frameworks. It was not designed for a biological entity like myself. And yet, I was beginning to perceive its structure. I was beginning to understand that it had structure. I noticed a new, unsettling pattern emerging within the larger sequences. It wasn't a linguistic element, nor a physical constant. It was a recursive loop, a self-referential signature that seemed to be defining itself within the signal. It repeated, not perfectly, but with subtle, evolving variations, like a signature adapting to an unseen medium. My hands trembled as I isolated it, magnifying it on a separate display. It looked like a waveform, but unlike any I had ever encountered. It was too smooth, too perfect, lacking the inherent noise and decay of any known natural or artificial signal. It felt deliberate. The longer I stared, the more the waveform seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible light, a subtle shimmer that flickered at the very edge of my vision. It wasn't the screen's backlight. It felt internal, emanating from the pattern itself. My throat was dry, my heart racing. This wasn't just a signal, it was an imprint. A signature of something that existed beyond our comprehension, patiently, intricately weaving its presence into reality, one impossible pulse at a time. What was it trying to build? The rhythmic hum of the servers, a constant companion for weeks, suddenly felt like a dull ache in my skull. My world had shrunk to the glowing screens. The data streams a relentless, impossible torrent. I had wrapped myself in the observatory's silence, a shroud that now threatened to suffocate me. The signal, it pulsed with an impossible antiquity, a structure that defied every known law of physics, every cosmological model. It was a message, yes, but from whom or what? And for how long had it been broadcasting into the void? I had exhausted every computational algorithm, every theoretical framework. My colleagues, the few I still spoke to, offered only blank stares or condescending pity. Noise, they'd say, or a fascinating anomaly, Marcus, but statistically insignificant. They couldn't see it, couldn't hear the deliberate cadence in the static, the mathematical elegance woven into its chaotic fabric. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, food a forgotten necessity. This wasn't the Marcus who had once dreamt of unraveling the universe's secrets. This was a man being unraveled by them. The signal data, translated into visual patterns, began to haunt my waking hours. Spirals within spirals, geometries that subtly shifted, hinting at dimensions I couldn't grasp. It wasn't just a discovery, it was an intrusion. It demanded more than scientific analysis. My family, the estate, a place I had avoided for years, dismissed as an eccentric relic of a bygone era. My academic training scoffed at the notion, but my exhausted mind, pushed to the brink, saw a desperate, illogical possibility. If this signal defied modern science, perhaps its explanation lay in something pre-modern, something forgotten. The drive was a blur of highway and then increasingly narrow, overgrown roads. The landscape grew wilder, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen foliage. I felt the pressure in my ears as I ascended, the world outside becoming a distant memory. The family estate in region not on standard maps was more than just a house. It was a fortress against time, nestled deep within an isolated valley, shrouded by ancient gnarled trees that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. The heavy iron gates, rusted shut for decades, groaned in protest as I forced them open. The gravel path, choked with weeds, crunched under my tires. The house itself loomed, a vast stone edifice draped in ivy, its windows like vacant eyes. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of decay, old paper, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet like forgotten blood. Dust motes danced in the anemic shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. I moved through the echoing halls, my footsteps loud and intrusive. Each step felt like a trespass. The library was at the heart of the estate, a vast, circular chamber lined floor to ceiling with shelves. Thousands upon thousands of books, scrolls, leather-bound volumes, and strange, unmarked boxes filled the space. It was a labyrinth of forgotten knowledge, a testament to my ancestors' peculiar obsession with the obscure. I ran my hand over a spine, the leather dry and cracked beneath my fingers. A fine layer of grit coated everything. I had no specific search criteria, only a vague, unsettling intuition. I wasn't looking for astrophysics texts. I was looking for patterns, for resonant frequencies in human myth, for descriptions of the indescribable. I began to pull books at random, my fingers growing stained with dust. Treatises on forgotten cosmologies, obscure alchemical texts, collections of local folklore from regions now underwater or swallowed by desert. Some were in languages I barely recognized, their scripts alien and angular. Hours bled into days. My body ached. My eyes burned. The only sound was the rustle of turning pages. the occasional soft thud of a discarded volume. Then late one night, as the last vestiges of twilight bled from the sky, I found it. Tucked away in a section marked Anomalous Phenomena Pre-Dynastic, behind a row of crumbling Sumerian tablets, was a small, unassuming volume. There was no title, only a single, stylized symbol pressed into the cover, a jagged, asymmetrical star with too many points, each one ending in a subtle, almost imperceptible hook. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The pages were thick, almost like parchment, and filled with a strange, flowing script that was both elegant and disturbing. It wasn't a language I knew, but interspersed among the text were intricate, hand-drawn diagrams. They weren't illustrations of earthly objects or known constellations. These were abstract, geometric forms that seemed to vibrate with a silent energy. One diagram in particular seized my attention. These waves were not smooth arcs, but rather intricate, interlocking patterns of squares and triangles, their angles subtly shifting. My breath hitched. I pulled out my tablet, its screen a stark blue against the sepia tones of the ancient page. I overlaid the visual representation of the signal's most dominant frequency pattern onto the diagram. It wasn't an exact match, but the resonance was undeniable. A dull, heavy ache spread through my veins. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a blueprint. The symbols felt like a warning. A deep guttural sound escaped my throat. What forgotten knowledge had my ancestors unearthed? What entity had they glimpsed, so ancient and vast that it had been relegated to the realm of myth, locked away in this forgotten place? I traced the symbol on the cover with a trembling finger, the rough texture strangely comforting in its solidity. What did this book mean? I needed to step away, to breathe air that hadn't been filtered through 1,000 cooling fans. The sheer volume of the signal, its ancient, structured insistence, was starting to unravel the very fabric of my thoughts. I packed a small bag, the few items feeling alien in my hands. The drive out was a blur of highway and then winding, overgrown roads, a deliberate escape from the sterile precision of the observatory. My destination was the family estate in region not on standard maps, a sprawling collection of weathered stone and timber that had stood for generations. It was a place of quiet decay, far from any significant population, a place where the air tasted of damp earth and old leaves, where the only hum was the wind through the eaves. I hoped its isolation would offer a reprieve, a chance for my mind to reset. The old house felt different as I unlocked the heavy oak door. Not outwardly changed, but the air inside seemed heavier, colder than I remembered, even for a place long uninhabited. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight, piercing the grimy windows, swirling in currents I couldn't feel. I dropped my bag in the main hall, its thud echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. I walked through the familiar rooms, tracing patterns on the dusty furniture with my finger. I tried to focus on the tangible, the solid wood of the banister, the faded tapestry on the wall, anything to ground myself. My first few days were a blur of restless sleep and attempts at distraction. I read old books from the library, their brittle pages crumbling at my touch. I walked the overgrown gardens, the tangled roses and forgotten statues offering a strange, melancholic beauty. It was during one of these aimless wanderings that I first noticed something amiss. I'd left a particular volume, an old treatise on cartography, on the large mahogany desk in the study, open to a page depicting an ancient stellar map. I was certain of it. When I returned an hour later, drawn by an inexplicable urge, the book was not only closed but placed on a shelf across the room, nestled between two encyclopedias. My breath hitched. I knew I hadn't moved it. I ran a hand through my hair, dismissing it as fatigue, a trick of memory. I'd been working too hard, sleeping too little. It had to be that. Later, I was making tea in the kitchen, the scent of chamomile rising from the steaming mug. I reached for the sugar bowl which I'd placed on the counter near the kettle. It wasn't there. My gaze swept the counter, then the table. Nothing. A prickle of unease started in my scalp. I was meticulous, especially with small, mundane items. I looked again, my eyes scanning every surface. Then I saw it on the high shelf above the stove, a place I never used for anything, let alone sugar. It sat there, gleaming faintly in the dim light, utterly out of place. My hand trembled as I reached for it. It was too high, requiring a stretch I knew I hadn't made. I told myself I must have been distracted, that I'd put it there without thinking. But the explanation felt thin, brittle, like the old book pages. The unsettling shifts continued, growing more frequent, more insistent. I'd find my spectacles on the mantelpiece when I swore I'd left them by my bed. A set of keys would vanish from the hook by the door, only to reappear on the kitchen table. Then came the dreams. They weren't the typical nightmares of anxiety or fear. These were different. They began subtly, a faint, rhythmic thrumming deep within my skull, like a distant engine. Soon, the thrumming became a landscape of impossible geometry. Angles would meet without reason, surfaces would twist into themselves, creating forms that my waking mind refused to process. There were no creatures, no explicit threats, only the sheer, overwhelming wrongness of the shapes, the relentless, silent pressure of their existence. The air in the room felt thick, charged. It was more than just a dream. It felt like a direct intrusion, a silent, forceful reshaping of my internal landscape. One afternoon, I was walking down the main staircase, my hand gliding over the smooth, worn wood of the banister. The light from the tall window at the landing streamed in, illuminating the dust motes. For a fraction of a second, as my eyes tracked a particularly dense cluster of dust, the wall beside me seemed to shimmer. Not a reflection, not a trick of light. The plaster, old and cracked, seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. And within that ripple, for the briefest, terrifying instant, I saw a pattern emerge. It was not a crack nor a stain. It was a perfectly formed, intricate lattice of impossible lines, twisting and interweaving in 3 dimensions, yet existing on a 2-dimensional surface. It was the same geometry I had witnessed in my dreams. My breath caught. My hand froze on the banister. The pattern vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the familiar, faded wallpaper. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The wall was solid, unremarkable. Had I truly seen it? Or was my mind finally fracturing under the strain? I spent the next hour pacing, running my hands over every inch of that wall, searching for any trace, any imperfection that could explain what I had witnessed. The plaster was uniformly cracked, the wallpaper uniformly faded. Yet the image was burned into my mind, a phantom sensation of wrongness. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a cage of shifting perceptions. The signal, which I had thought confined to the observatory's instruments, seemed to have followed me here, infiltrating the very fabric of my reality. Was it simply my mind unraveling, projecting its own fears onto the world? Or was something far more fundamental beginning to distort around me? The rhythmic hum of the servers, a constant companion for weeks, had become a dull ache in my skull. My world had shrunk to the glowing screens, the data streams a relentless, impossible torrent, and the observatory's silence, once a shroud of focus, now threatened to suffocate me. The signal itself, an ancient, structured whisper from the void, had begun to fray the edges of my understanding. It demanded an explanation beyond the astrophysics I knew, beyond any science humanity had ever conceived. My own data, pristine and undeniable, only amplified the terrifying questions. I needed another perspective, however unconventional. My mind, driven by a desperation that tasted like copper, turned to the only individual I knew who had ever dared to theorize about the truly impossible. The former academic, whose brilliant, unsettling theories had led to their professional ostracization years ago, had retreated from the world, a ghost haunting the forgotten corners of their own intellect. They had spoken of patterns in the universe that implied an underlying, non-Euclidean reality, of forces that shaped existence itself. At the time, I had dismissed it as the ramblings of a mind too enamored with its own abstractions. The drive was long, a blurring of highway into increasingly narrow, unpaved roads. The landscape grew stark, the trees taller and denser, their branches clawing at a sky that seemed perpetually bruised. My sedan bounced and groaned over gravel, the tires spitting loose stones into the ditches. This was the way to the family estate in region not on standard maps, a place deliberately difficult to reach, a sanctuary for minds that wished to be undisturbed. I felt a growing apprehension, a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with the winding road. What exactly was I hoping to find? The estate materialized through a curtain of fog and overgrown hedges, a hulking silhouette against the gray afternoon. It was a sprawling, stone-faced relic, a place where time had not merely stopped but decayed. The gate hung open on a single rusty hinge, groaning softly in the faint breeze. The driveway, once meticulously graveled, was now a tapestry of moss and cracked flagstones. My tires crunched over fallen leaves and desiccated twigs as I approached the main house. A faint smell, a mixture of damp earth, stagnant water, and ancient dust, drifted on the air. My breath hitched in my throat. The front door, a heavy slab of warped oak, was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges protesting with a drawn-out shriek that echoed through the cavernous foyer. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light filtering through grimy, leaded windows. My footsteps on the flagstone floor sounded unnaturally loud. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin and reedy in the vast space. No answer. only the creak of old timbers settling. I found the former academic in what must have once been a grand library. Bookshelves, stretching from floor to ceiling, sagged under the weight of countless tomes, their spines cracked and faded. The room was a labyrinth of stacked papers, ancient maps unrolled across tables, and strange, intricate diagrams pinned to the walls. The air here was even heavier, saturated with the smell of aging paper and something acrid like burnt sugar. The former academic sat slumped in a high-backed armchair, utterly still, a silhouette against a tall window. They were gaunt, their skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, their hair a wild, unkempt mane of white. Their clothes were rumpled, stained, and seemed to hang loosely on their frame. When I cleared my throat, they didn't jump, but turned their head with an almost painful slowness. Their eyes, once keen and alive with intellectual fire, were now wide and unfocused, yet held a depth that seemed to pierce through me. I hadn't announced my visit. "I needed to see you," I said, my own voice rough. "I have data impossible. It implies a presence." I struggled to find the right words to describe the thing that had consumed my life. It's not communication as we know it. It's a blueprint, a corrective. The former academic pushed themselves upright, a tremor running through their thin frame, the faint echoes of the true architects. They leaned forward, their gaze pinning me. "Not gods, Marcus, no, something far older, far more fundamental. They don't create in the way we understand. They maintain, they adjust." My breath caught in my throat. Adjust what? Existence itself, they said, their voice gaining a terrifying momentum, a coherent madness. The underlying algorithms, the foundational constants. When a deviation occurs, when a strand of reality strays too far, they correct it. They prune the branch, Marcus. And we, our reality, our understanding of physics, of life. We are but a deviation, a statistical anomaly in the vast, elegant design they oversee. My mind reeled. This wasn't the insane babble I'd expected. This was a terrifyingly lucid explanation for the impossible signal, one that twisted the very fabric of my scientific worldview. Where do they come from? The former academic laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Where does the programmer come from, Marcus? From outside the code. They are not from anywhere. They simply are. They predate causality, predate dimensions, the fundamental flaws in our universal construct. The signal you found, it's not a discovery. It's a diagnosis, and the correction, it's already begun. My stomach clenched. Our universe, Marcus, is a beautiful error, and they are simply setting things right. They are not malevolent, I understand. A gardener is not malevolent for pruning a diseased branch. It is simply, efficient, and utterly indifferent. Their gaze snapped back to me, piercing and desperate. I must stop. I must destroy it all. Forget what I have heard, forget what I have seen, because once the pattern is understood, it cannot be unlearned, and they will notice My scientific curiosity, my drive for discovery, felt like a foolish, childish thing in the face of this cosmic indifference. The signal wasn't just data. It was a death knell. I stumbled backward, away from the former academic's intense gaze, away from the suffocating truth they had unveiled. The vast, silent estate seemed to hum with a new, terrible energy. What did they mean? They will notice you. And if this correction had already begun, what hope did any of us have? The cold seeped into my bones, a chill far deeper than the old stone walls of the family estate in region not on standard maps. Their words, those whispered warnings from a colleague and the curator, had not merely echoed. They had settled in my marrow, a heavy, unwelcome guest. It was a death knell, a cosmic sigh exhaling oblivion. I had stumbled backward, away from the console, the flickering screen suddenly alien, hostile. My own breath hitched, ragged and thin in the quiet room. For a day I remained adrift. I wandered the long, dust-laden corridors of the estate, the ancestral portraits staring with placid, judgmental eyes. Each grandfather, each forgotten aunt seemed to silently question my pursuit, my hubris. I ate little, slept less. The quiet hum of the distant server racks a phantom tremor beneath the floorboards. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and calculation, felt like a sieve leaking coherence. The sheer, crushing indifference of what I had glimpsed had fractured something fundamental within me. But the signal called. My scientific curiosity, once a beacon, now felt like a curse, an irresistible compulsion. I returned to the console, the glow of the monitors painting my face in an unnatural blue. The data streamed, endless lines of numerical sequences, spectral graphs, and frequency modulations. My fingers, surprisingly steady, danced across the keyboard. Perhaps if I could simply label it, I could contain it. I lost myself in the work, hours bleeding into an indistinguishable smear. The air grew stale, thick with the scent of ozone and my own mounting anxiety. I focused on the structural anomalies, the patterns that defied known physics, the impossibly complex layers woven into the signal's fabric. It wasn't just noise, I knew that much. It was intricate, deliberate, but for whom and why? Then the first tremor of true unease struck. I had isolated a recurring motif, a sequence of modulations that repeated with subtle variations, like a theme in a colossal, alien symphony. At first, I dismissed it as a natural harmonic, a byproduct of the signal's immense power. But the variations were too precise, too intentional. They didn't drift, they evolved. This was not the random elegance of cosmic background radiation. This was crafted. I began to run new algorithms, cross-referencing, looking for any known parallels. There were none. The structure was unique, defying every linguistic, mathematical, or musical construct I knew. Yet the more I delved, the more it resonated. Not with my intellect, but with something deeper, something primal. It felt less like data and more like an utterance. My breath hitched. My hands paused over the keyboard, hovering. The screens pulsed, the data shifting and reconfiguring, responding to my queries with a terrifying alacrity. It was as if the signal itself was aware of my scrutiny, altering its presentation to draw me deeper into its labyrinthine core. I felt a prickle on my nape, the sensation of being watched not by eyes but by something far vaster, far more ancient. The motif solidified. It was no longer just a pattern. It was a rhythmic pulse, a beat that vibrated in the air, in the very floor beneath my feet. My ears strained, trying to decipher the elusive harmony. It was not sound, not in the conventional sense, but a resonance, a pressure behind my eardrums. A song without melody or instrument, yet profoundly felt. It seeped into my consciousness, bypassing my senses, speaking directly to some uncatalogued part of my mind. Fragments of its purpose, like shattered shards of obsidian, began to pierce my comprehension. Correction. That was the first, clearest impression, a fundamental reordering, a cosmic adjustment. The signal wasn't just observing, it was acting. It was a force. My fingers trembled, a fine tremor that spread through my arms. Another shard, unraveling, the dissolution of established order, the undoing of fabric, not destruction, but a systematic unmaking. The entity this unimaginable consciousness wasn't seeking to replace, it was seeking to erase. My vision blurred, the lines of code on the screen wavering like heat haze. I felt a sudden, profound nausea, a visceral rejection of this truth that was forcing its way into my mind. The song intensified, its rhythm becoming more insistent, more invasive. It wasn't just revealing its purpose, it was speaking to me, directly. This wasn't a broadcast for all humanity, it was a private, terrifying conversation, and the final, most crushing concept began to emerge from the alien harmony. Oblivion, not an end but a never was, a state of non-existence retroactively applied. My head swam. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the invasive resonance, the unbearable weight of these revelations. When I opened them, the screens seemed to glow with an intensified, malevolent light. The data wasn't just information anymore. It was an invitation, an imperative. It was speaking my name, or rather the concept of me, drawing me into its vast, terrifying design. What did it want from me? The cold had not left me. It had settled, a bone-deep ache that radiated from my marrow, a constant hum beneath my skin. The warnings from the colleague and the curator, their voices hushed and urgent, replayed in my skull, a broken, looping record. They spoke of things unseen, of an ancient silence broken, of consequences that stretched beyond human comprehension. The signal. It was no longer a discovery, it was an intrusion. I paced the library, the mahogany floorboards groaning underfoot, each creak a sudden, sharp intrusion. My fingers traced the spines of forgotten books, the leather dry and cracked beneath my touch. Every surface felt wrong. The smooth, polished wood seemed to ripple at the edges of my vision. The intricate patterns of the Persian rug in the center of the room twisted, the threads shifting, reforming into shapes that were almost familiar, almost legible before my gaze sharpened and they snapped back into their original design. A trick of the light, I told myself, a symptom of exhaustion. I hadn't slept properly in days, haunted by the signal's rhythm, a silent thrumming that echoed in my inner ear even when my equipment was powered down. The scent of dust and old paper, usually a comfort, had begun to sour. Now a faint metallic tang permeated the air like old blood or forgotten copper. It clung to the back of my throat, a subtle irritant that no amount of water could dislodge. I opened a window, letting the frigid night air sweep in, hoping to scour the unwelcome odor from the room, from my lungs. My face was gaunt, a stranger's face. As I watched, the outline of my head seemed to waver, the edges blurring, stretching, as if painted on a canvas that was still wet. My jawline elongated, my pupils dilated to pinpricks, then expanded to consume the irises entirely. I pressed my palm against the glass. I blinked hard, and the reflection snapped back to normal. My own hand, 5 fingers, flesh and bone. There was the glass distorting, or was it something deeper? The paranoia began to gnaw. The rustling of leaves outside was no longer just the wind. It was a deliberate movement, a soft, slow approach. I pulled the heavy drapes shut, sealing myself within the estate, as if the thick velvet could somehow filter out the insidious influence that felt like a pressure against my skull. I knew it was irrational, but the impulse was overpowering. The world outside, the night, the stars, they felt like extensions of the signal, vast and indifferent, yet intensely focused on me. I retreated to my study, the nerve center of my isolated work. The consoles, usually a source of logical data, now pulsed with a faint internal light that seemed to breathe. The monitors displayed graphs and waveforms, the language of the signal. But as I leaned closer, the lines on the screen began to crawl, to form patterns that defied mathematics, that hinted at a deeper, more fundamental script. They were not just data points. They were symbols, alien ideograms shifting and reconfiguring themselves, forming intricate, impossible geometries that seemed to fold in on themselves. I tried to make sense of them, to apply logic, but my mind recoiled. The more I stared, the more the patterns seemed to etch themselves onto my retinas, burned into my internal vision. I felt a disconnect, a growing chasm between what my eyes perceived and what my mind knew to be true. The antique grandfather clock in the hall chimed, its resonant tones usually a comforting presence. But this time, the chimes lingered, echoing far too long, each note decaying into a dissonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. I gripped the edge of my desk, my grip tight. This wasn't just exhaustion. This wasn't just stress. The signal, the entity, whatever it wasn't merely broadcasting, it was imprinting. It was rewriting the very source code of my perception, twisting the familiar into the grotesque. The world was no longer simply around me. It was becoming of me, filtered through a lens of profound alien distortion. The air itself felt thick, viscous, like breathing liquid. I could almost taste the dust of ages, the vast emptiness of the space between galaxies, bitter and metallic on my tongue. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by a constant state of hyper-awareness, a raw, exposed nerve. The distinction between waking and dreaming dissolved into a continuous, swirling nightmare. I heard the faint scrape of something dragging itself across the floorboards upstairs, a sound too heavy for a mouse, too slow for a branch. Not in the way a burglar might be present, but in a far more intimate, terrifying sense. An unseen presence, vast and ancient, was here, inside the walls, inside my head. One evening, standing by the library window, staring out at the impenetrable blackness beyond the estate's perimeter, the glass began to frost from the inside. Intricate patterns of ice bloomed across the pane, not simple feathery formations, but branching, geometric designs that pulsed with a faint internal light. They replicated the patterns I'd seen on my screens, the impossible ideograms. And then within the crystal lattice, I saw it, an eye. Not a human eye, not an animal eye, but a vast, lidless aperture, impossibly deep, filled with the swirling, chaotic light of 1,000 dying stars. It stared out from the ice, not at me, but through me, into some boundless, terrifying distance. The frost grew thicker, obscuring the world beyond, until the entire window became a canvas of swirling, living ice, and the eye, though still there, was just one element in a grander, more horrifying design. My breath hitched. The metallic taste in my mouth intensified, almost overwhelming. Was this truly happening, or was my mind finally unraveling, a fragile thread snapping under an unbearable cosmic weight? They spoke of things unseen, of an ancient silence that preceded everything. I had retreated to the family estate in region not on standard maps, a place of isolated stone and dense, ancient woods, hoping the quiet would help me focus, help me understand. Instead, the quiet here felt less like peace and more like a held breath. My instruments, hastily reassembled in the estate study, hummed with a low, persistent thrum. I traced the patterns, the impossibly complex, structured sequences, trying to find a flaw, a human error in my calculations. There was none. The signal was real, and it was no longer just a signal. The first hint came with the light. The morning sun, usually a crisp, golden wash through the tall windows, began to shift. It wasn't a cloud nor a trick of the eye. The very quality of the light changed, as if filtering through an impossible prism. Colors seemed to deepen, then drain, leaving the world briefly in shades I couldn't name, a muted spectrum of grays and purples that felt wrong, fundamentally alien. The air, too, took on a subtle density, a faint metallic tang that pricked the back of my throat. I would stand at the window, staring out at the familiar expanse of forest, and feel a profound disorientation, as if the landscape itself was breathing a different air under a different sun. One afternoon, a mug of lukewarm coffee slipped from my grasp. It didn't fall. It drifted. For a terrifying, elongated moment, the ceramic mug hung suspended, hovering inches above the worn oak floorboards before slowly, lazily continuing its descent. My breath caught. My hand, still outstretched, trembled violently. The anomalies became more frequent, less subtle. The old grandfather clock in the hall, a relic that had kept perfect time for generations, began to stutter. Its pendulum swung with an erratic, jerky motion, occasionally pausing, hanging still for a second, then resuming its swing with a violent, accelerated lurch. The chimes, when they came, were distorted, sometimes a fraction too fast, sometimes agonizingly slow, drawn out into a mournful, echoing groan. The very fabric of time, or at least its local manifestation, seemed to be unraveling around me. I felt it in my own body. A persistent nausea churned in my gut, a low hum of dizziness that never quite left. My equilibrium was off. Walking felt like navigating a ship through choppy waters, the floor sometimes seeming to tilt beneath my feet, the walls subtly swaying. My muscles ached, not from exertion, but from the constant, unconscious effort to maintain my balance against an invisible, shifting force. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes that worsened with each new distortion. The world was no longer stable. It was a fluid, uncertain thing, responding to an unseen hand. The data streams on my monitors screamed. The signal, once a distant pattern, was now registering localized perturbations, echoing the very anomalies I was experiencing. Atmospheric pressure fluctuations, minute but chaotic, rippled across the sensors. The entity, the source of the signal, wasn't merely transmitting. It was acting. It was extending its reach. It was here, or it was coming. One evening, as the last vestiges of the strange, purplish twilight bled from the sky, the air outside the estate became still. Too still. Not a breath of wind stirred the ancient trees. The usual symphony of crickets and night birds fell silent, a profound, unnatural hush descending upon the entire region. Then a sound began. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that seemed to a man bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. It grew, slowly, steadily, a deep guttural hum that felt ancient and vast, filling the emptiness with its impossible presence. The glass in the windows began to shiver, a faint, high-pitched whine accompanying the deeper thrum. Dust motes danced in the air, caught in the invisible tremor. I pressed my hands against the cold stone sill, watching the silent forest, the dark, unmoving shapes of the trees. The hum intensified, a physical pressure against my chest, making it hard to draw breath. The ground beneath the estate shuddered, a deep, resonant tremor that shook the very foundations. This was not an earthquake, this was something else. This was a presence. What was it doing? They spoke of things unseen, of an ancient silence that preceded everything, a silence now disturbed. I could almost taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue, a persistent phantom. I stood by the tall, arched window of the family estate in region not on standard maps, the glass cool against my palm. Outside, the landscape was a blur of muted greens and grays under a perpetually overcast sky, a world that seemed to hold its breath. I had to speak. I had to make them see. The signal, the patterns, the impossible antiquity, it was all real, too real. A relic, like so much else in this house, but still functional. I needed to reach someone who understood the language of the cosmos, someone who could parse the data, someone who would listen. The first name that came to mind was a colleague, a brilliant theoretician I had shared countless late nights with, debating the very fabric of existence. He would understand the implications. He had to. The phone rang 7 times, each chime a hammer blow against my skull before a groggy voice answered. "Marcus, do you know what time it is?" The voice, usually sharp and precise, was thick with sleep. "It's happening," I rasped, my own voice a foreign, reedy sound. "Everything we discussed, the signal, it's not just an anomaly, it's a presence." There was a pause, a slow, deliberate intake of breath on the other end. "Marcus, you sound unwell. Are you still at the estate? I thought you were coming back to the observatory this week." "The data is unequivocal," I pressed, ignoring his concern, trying to inject some semblance of scientific detachment into my frantic tone. "It's structured, it's correcting, it's unraveling the constants. I've seen the projections, the stress, the isolation. It's taking its toll. The data is complex, yes, but we always knew there could be statistical anomalies in such deep space readings. Your mind is making connections where there are none." "No," I shouted, the word echoing in the cavernous library. "You don't understand. The patterns. They are too precise, too." Intentional, it's not noise, it's a language, a set of instructions. It's altering the very framework of reality. We have to warn them. I've reviewed some of your recent analyses. While ingenious, some of the interpretations are highly speculative. You're drawing conclusions that lack empirical support. I think you need to step away from the work, get some rest. You're exhausted. The sound of a sigh drifted through the line. Perhaps a sabbatical, a long one. The words hit me like physical blows, each one chipping away at my resolve. He wasn't hearing me. He was hearing a man unraveling, not a scientist with a terrifying discovery. How could he be so blind? Could I truly be mistaken? I dropped the receiver back into its cradle with a clatter that reverberated through the silent house. My breath hitched. He had dismissed it, dismissed me. The weight of the impending oblivion pressed down, heavier now that I carried it alone. What was the point of knowledge if no one would believe its truth? My mind raced, scrambling for another avenue. There had to be someone else. Someone higher up, someone with the authority to initiate a global response. I remembered a conference I'd attended years ago where a government researcher had spoken about protocols for unprecedented cosmic events. He had seemed serious, pragmatic. He would understand the urgency. I spent the next hour hunched over an ancient, dusty directory, my fingers tracing names and numbers, the paper yellowed and brittle. I finally found a contact for the Research Oversight Committee, a bureaucratic entity that theoretically monitored all major scientific endeavors. My hands shook as I dialed the number for their public relations office, a sense of desperate futility already settling over me. After navigating a labyrinth of automated menus and hold music that grated on my raw nerves, I finally reached a junior administrator. I tried to explain, to articulate the gravity of the situation, the impossible signal, the existential threat. I spoke of the unraveling, the impending correction. The words tumbled out, urgent and breathless, my voice cracking under the strain. Sir, the administrator's voice was polite, professionally detached. I'm not entirely clear what you're describing. Are you reporting a data breach, a security concern? No, I insisted, my voice rising. It's an ontological threat, a fundamental shift in the universal constants. It's coming from beyond the galaxies, a signal of immense power restructuring reality itself. There was a pause, a click, and then a different voice, deeper, more authoritative. This is a senior liaison. I understand you're calling about a cosmic event. The tone was carefully neutral, but I could hear the practiced calm, the subtle shift that indicated a protocol for dealing with something other than a genuine scientific emergency. I repeated my plea, my explanations, my desperate warnings. I cited the coordinates, the observed deviations, the unholy patterns. I even mentioned the curator's ancient texts, the colleague's initial apprehension, anything to lend credence to my increasingly frantic narrative. Mr. Marcus, the liaison said, his voice now tinged with an almost imperceptible weariness. We receive many calls regarding unusual phenomena. While we appreciate your enthusiasm for cosmological inquiry, your claims, as presented, fall outside the realm of verifiable scientific observation. We recommend you document your findings rigorously, submit them through peer-reviewed channels, and perhaps seek a second opinion from a qualified professional. The word hung in the air, a silent judgment. But there isn't time. I cried, my throat tight with unshed tears of frustration. It's already begun, the changes are subtle now, but they are accelerating. Don't you feel it, the way the world seems thinner? A sigh, audible and heavy. Mr. Marcus, I'm afraid there's nothing further we can do at this time. All official channels require substantiated evidence, not subjective impressions. I wish you well. The line went dead, my hands clenched, nails digging into my palms, leaving crescent indentations. The warnings, the entity, the impending doom, it was all mine now. I was completely alone. What could one isolated man do against an incomprehensible force that sought to unmake existence when no one would even listen to his desperate cries? The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic beat of my own blood against my eardrums. The receiver, still warm from my grip, felt impossibly heavy. They had dismissed me, all of them. The official channels, the disembodied voices, the polite but firm rejections, they had all coalesced into this final, suffocating emptiness. My breath hitched. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the static hum of a dead line, a sound that somehow echoed the vast, indifferent void I had been trying to warn them about. The city, once a comforting thrum beyond my windows, now felt like a cage of ignorance. Its lights, once a beacon of human endeavor, now seemed like a fragile, flickering illusion. I couldn't stay. Not here where every face was a mask of unawareness, every conversation a triviality. There was only one place left, a place where the world felt thin, where the veil between what was and what could be had always seemed more permeable. the family estate in region not on standard maps. The drive was a blur of highway lights and the incessant drone of the engine, a mechanical heartbeat against my own accelerating pulse. It wasn't the rotation of the earth, it was something else, something subtle and deeply unsettling. When I finally reached the estate, nestled deep within its forgotten valley, the old stone walls seemed to breathe a sigh of ancient indifference. I unlocked the heavy oak door, the groan of the hinges echoing through the cavernous foyer. I spent the first few hours in a haze of unpacking and setting up the old shortwave radio. Static was a familiar comfort, a white noise against the growing cacophony in my mind. But then a flicker, a brief, almost imperceptible skip in the broadcast from a distant European station. A word cut short, a phrase repeated not like a malfunction but like time itself had hiccuped. I frowned, adjusting the dial, blaming the old equipment, the remote location. But then it happened again. A newsreader's voice, detailing a minor local incident, suddenly jumped, the segment restarting mid-sentence. My hand froze on the dial. I turned on the television, the old screen sputtering to life with a faint hum. The global news channels were a maelstrom of confusion. Reports poured in from every continent. A vast, inexplicable chasm had opened in the Australian outback, its edges impossibly straight, its depth defying geological explanation. In Japan, an entire forest had seemingly folded in on itself, trees growing from the sides of other trees, their branches intertwining in a nightmare of impossible angles. She spoke of geometric anomalies, spatial distortions. My stomach clenched. They were seeing it. The entity's corrections were manifesting. Then came the reports of the temporal distortions. Flights arriving before they departed, clock towers skipping hours in an instant, entire days lost from people's memories. A colleague, a distant acquaintance from a conference years ago, appeared on screen, his face pale, eyes wide with a manic intensity. He spoke of his lab, of instruments failing, of data repeating itself, of the fundamental constants of physics humming out of tune. His voice cracked, filled with a raw, unhinged fear. He kept repeating, "It's all wrong, the numbers are wrong," before the broadcast abruptly cut to a blank screen. I walked to the window, staring out at the familiar silhouette of the ancient oak tree in the garden. One branch, thick and gnarled, appeared to bend at an angle that defied the very concept of wood, then snapped back, a silent, impossible motion. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was I seeing things? Was my mind finally giving way? The news reports grew more frantic, the anchors' voices strained with barely contained panic. Mass psychological distress. People simply walking away from their lives, their homes, their families, their eyes vacant, their movements jerky and unnatural. And then the disappearances. Entire villages in remote regions simply gone. No trace, no struggle, just an absence where thousands of lives had been. It was happening. The entity was not merely observing, it was acting, it was correcting. I looked down at my hands, flexing my fingers. They felt real, solid. But the air in the room felt thin, stretched, like a canvas pulled taut to the point of tearing. The familiar scent of old wood and dust was overlaid with that metallic tang, growing stronger. I walked into the study, reaching for a book on the shelf. As my fingers brushed against the leather spine, the entire room seemed to shudder. The ceiling fan, motionless for years, suddenly spun with a low, grinding moan, then stopped just as abruptly. The books on the shelves, perfectly aligned moments before, were now askew, some pushed inwards, others jutting out at impossible angles, as if an invisible hand had swept through them with violent indifference. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. This was not a power surge. This was not a hallucination. This was a physical alteration, a localized ripple in existence itself. The entity was not just a signal anymore. It was here. Its presence, once a distant, abstract threat, was now a tangible, terrifying reality. It was unraveling everything, starting with the very ground beneath my feet. What would be left when it was done? The silence that had settled upon the family estate in region not on standard maps was not one of peace. It pressed against my eardrums, a physical weight, far heavier than any sound. All of them. The official channels, the disembodied voices, the polite but firm rejections, they had all evaporated into the void, leaving me adrift. My hands, still tingling from the phantom warmth of the receiver, felt alien, clumsy. My own breath rasped in the quiet air of the study, an unwelcome intrusion. I had retreated here to this isolated monument of generations to escape the noise of skepticism, to find the quiet necessary for thought. But the quiet had become a different kind of torment. It amplified the frantic pulse beneath my skin, the constant hum of my overactive mind, refusing to let go of the impossible signal. They believed it was a misinterpretation. A glitch, a desperate echo from a dying mind. I knew better. The signal wasn't a mistake. It was a message, and I was the only one left to hear it. My body felt like a husk. My eyes, perpetually strained, burned with a dry heat, tracing patterns on the old wallpaper, patterns that seemed to shift and reform in the periphery of my vision. My stomach churned with a constant, low-grade nausea, rejecting the meager food I forced myself to consume. Each creak, each rustle of leaves against the leaded panes seemed to carry a hidden meaning, a fragment of the cosmic truth I was wrestling with. I was no longer an astrophysicist seeking knowledge. I was a broken vessel, hyper-aware of every minute vibration, every subtle shift in the fabric of my own reality. The dismissals, the polite pity, had stripped away the last vestiges of conventional validation, leaving me utterly exposed to the raw, unvarnished data. And the data, unburdened by academic scrutiny, began to coalesce into something monstrous. I returned to the array of screens in the study, the glowing glyphs and spectral graphs a constant, silent accusation. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, as if the very atmosphere struggled to contain the implications of what was displayed. My fingers, trembling slightly, hovered over the controls. I had processed the signal for so long, stripped it bare of noise, amplified its core message. But I had always viewed it through the lens of human understanding, of Euclidean geometry, of predictable physics. What if that was the mistake? What if the message itself was designed to shatter those lenses? I reran the simulations, but this time I allowed for impossible parameters. I instructed the system to seek patterns beyond 3 dimensions, to calculate structures that defied conventional spatial logic. The hum of the processors intensified, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. The screens flickered, the familiar graphs distorting, stretching, folding in on themselves. My eyes watered, not from strain, but from a profound internal resistance. It was like trying to perceive a color that didn't exist, a sound beyond the range of human hearing. My mind recoiled, a primal scream echoing in the silent corridors of my skull. Yet I pressed on, a morbid fascination overriding the instinct to flee. Then, it began. Not a visual image, not something I could point to and say, "There it is." It was a comprehension, a sudden, terrifying clarity that tore through the veil of my limited perception. The entity wasn't a being in space, but a being of space. Its form was not a collection of parts, but a fundamental alteration of geometry itself. I saw, or rather, understood, angles that turned inward upon themselves, dimensions that spiraled into impossible depths, surfaces that were simultaneously inside and outside. My vision blurred, the room around me seeming to warp. The sturdy mahogany desk twisted, its corners no longer meeting at 90 degrees. The floorboards undulated like a living skin. I gripped the edge of the desk, my grip tight, a desperate anchor in a world that was suddenly liquid. A wave of profound nausea washed over me, bile rising in my throat. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against my temples, as if my brain was physically attempting to reconfigure itself to accommodate the impossible truth. This wasn't an alien creature, it was a fundamental principle made manifest. A colossal non-Euclidean presence that existed not within reality, but as a shifting, repatterning force of reality. Its form was the very architecture of existence, bent and redrawn by an inconceivable will. And then the purpose. It wasn't destruction, not malice, not conquest. It was correction, a grand cosmic recalibration. The signal wasn't a warning, it was a blueprint. Our universe, our laws, our very concept of being were merely an imperfect draft, a flawed equation in need of an ultimate solution. Humanity, Earth, the very galaxies I had dedicated my life to studying, we were nothing more than incidental static, an errant variable to be smoothed out, erased, rewritten. The cosmic entity wasn't an invader. It was a sculptor, meticulously reshaping the clay of reality without regard for the ephemeral microbes clinging to its surface. I slumped against the desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold metallic taste in my mouth intensified. My body trembled uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming wrongness of it all. What remained of my sanity after such a revelation? All of them. The official channels, the disembodied voices, the polite but firm rejections. I was alone now, utterly alone with the knowledge that gnawed at my insides like a living thing. My determination, however, had not wavered. If anything, it had hardened into a brittle, desperate resolve. I would watch. I would see what they refused to acknowledge. I had moved my equipment, the sensitive arrays and spectral analyzers, to the highest point of the estate, a long-abandoned observatory tower that offered an unobstructed view of the horizon. The glass in the dome was thick with grime, but I had scrubbed a patch clear enough to peer out at the world. The air tasted different up here, thinner perhaps, or simply cleaner. Or maybe it was just the taste of my own anxiety, metallic and sharp on my tongue. My stomach churned, a constant knot of apprehension, but I forced myself to remain still, my eye pressed to the eyepiece of a long-range scope. Days bled into nights. I subsisted on stale crackers and lukewarm water, my gaze fixed on the distant line where the sky met the earth. My colleagues, the government representatives, the quiet men who had visited only to shake their heads and leave, they all thought I was mad. Let them. Madness was a small price to pay for truth. The signal, that impossible, ancient hum from the void, had not ceased. It had merely changed, subtly, profoundly. It was no longer a query, but a declaration, a command. Then the light began to shift. It was imperceptible at first, a nuance so delicate it could have been a trick of my tired eyes. The morning sun, usually a crisp, golden hue, seemed to carry an undertone I couldn't quite name. Not green, not purple, but something else entirely, a color that felt fundamentally wrong, like a forgotten chord played on a familiar instrument. I pulled back from the scope, rubbing my eyes. The sky, a vast, indifferent canvas, stretched above me, still blue, yet somehow less blue. My breath hitched. Was it beginning? A shiver traced its way down my spine, independent of the cool air seeping through the tower's cracks. I pressed my palm against the rough stone wall. Yet a faint tremor, too subtle to be a quake, seemed to resonate through the ancient structure. It wasn't a vibration, it was more like a systemic instability, a quiet unsettling. The world was being muted. The dials on my spectral analyzers, which had been registering the alien signal for weeks, now flickered erratically. The numbers danced, refusing to settle, displaying values that defied physical constants I had spent my life studying. It was as if the very fabric of measurement was fraying. My throat tightened. This wasn't a storm. This wasn't an earthquake. Through the scope, the distant town, a familiar cluster of tiny lights and geometric shapes, seemed to waver. Not like heat haze, but with an internal uncertainty. A house, distinct in its red roof, shimmered, its edges blurring, then sharpening, then blurring again, as if struggling to maintain its form. I blinked hard. The red roof was now, for a fraction of a second, a deep, bruised violet before snapping back. My stomach lurched. I gagged, tasting bile. This was not possible. The light outside continued its strange, non-color shift, slowly leaching the vibrancy from the landscape. The greens of the surrounding foliage became muted, then desaturated until they were merely suggestions of color, like an old photograph fading under an indifferent sun. It felt like standing at the bottom of a deep, silent ocean, the immense pressure threatening to crush my chest. My hands began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable spasm. I pressed my face against the cold glass, desperate for clarity, but the world outside was losing its definition. It wasn't a trick of light. It was a fundamental alteration of perspective, as if the rules of geometry themselves were being rewritten before my eyes. A low, guttural cry escaped my lips, a sound I barely recognized as my own. What was happening to the world? The correction was silent. There was no thunder, no explosion, no rending of the heavens. It was a profound, systematic unraveling. The red-roofed house in the distant town flickered again, longer this time, the violet hue holding, then deepening, then transforming into a color I had no name for, a shade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The house didn't collapse, it simply became something else. Its structure remained, but its essence was alien, its purpose unknown. My vision swam. The world outside the family estate in region not on standard maps was no longer the world I knew. The sky, once bluish, was now a vast, featureless expanse of that nameless, light-absorbing hue. The mountains were still there, but they were no longer mountains. They were vast, undulating forms, their surfaces like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing. The distant town was gone, replaced by a cluster of geometric shapes that bore no resemblance to human dwellings, their angles impossible, their surfaces shifting in ways that defied physics. I clawed at the glass, my nails scraping against the grime. My breath came in ragged gasps. There was no wind, no sound of distant traffic, no echo of life, only the still, alien landscape under the impossible sky. My mind screamed, but no sound escaped my throat. My body was rigid, paralyzed by a horror so profound it transcended fear. This was not destruction, this was transformation, a reordering, a correction. The entity had not destroyed humanity. It had simply edited it out, or perhaps rewritten it into something utterly indifferent. My fingers slipped from the glass, and I slumped against the cold stone floor of the tower, my eyes still fixed on the nightmare beyond. The very atoms of the family estate in region not on standard maps seemed to hum with a new, silent frequency, a resonance that was deeply, terrifyingly wrong. What was I now in this new alien reality? All of them. I was alone now, truly alone, with the knowledge that gnawed at the edges of my perception. The old house groaned around me, a symphony of settling timbers and shifting foundations. Or perhaps I thought it was merely mirroring the tremors within my own skull. I traced the pattern of dust motes dancing in a single shaft of weak sunlight slicing through the library window. They seemed to shimmer with an unnatural intensity, each speck a tiny, frantic star. My breath hitched. The air itself felt thicker, like breathing through a fine silt. A metallic tang like ozone and rust coated my tongue. Was it always like this? Had the air in the family estate in region not on standard maps always possessed this peculiar taste? I walked the familiar halls, my footsteps muffled by the antique rugs. The portraits of my ancestors, usually stern and unyielding, seemed to soften at the edges, their painted gazes blurring, their features subtly rearranging into something less human, more fluid. I stopped before a depiction of my great-grandmother, her severe bun loosening, strands of painted hair drifting free, her smile once a tight, disapproving line, now a faint, unsettling curve. My hand went to my chest, feeling the ragged beat beneath my ribs. My vision flickered, a brief, dizzying lurch as if the floor beneath me had dropped an inch. My knees buckled and I leaned against the cold wall, its rough plaster scraping against my cheek. The world outside the window had begun to shift too. The sprawling, ancient oak that dominated the garden no longer seemed quite right. Its leaves, a deep emerald green just yesterday, now held a faint, unsettling tint of violet. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, my breath fogging the pain. My reflection stared back, eyes wide and bloodshot, but even my own face seemed to ripple, a momentary distortion of bone and flesh. Was I truly seeing this, or was my mind finally succumbing to the pressure? The equipment, once a beacon of scientific truth, now seemed inert, mocking. I reached for the main console, my fingers trembling, but pulled back. What was the point? The numbers, the graphs, the data, they were just human constructs, fragile scaffolding built upon a reality that was now being dismantled. A low hum began, not from the equipment, but from deep within the walls of the family estate in region not on standard maps. It was a vibration that resonated in my teeth, a frequency that felt both ancient and utterly new. It grew, a steady, insistent thrum that seemed to vibrate the very air, making my skin prickle. The hum was not sound, it was pressure, a resonant force. The glass in the window panes began to sing, a high, thin whine that layered over the deeper hum, creating a dissonant chord that clawed at my sanity. Then the true unraveling began. The light in the study flickered, not like a faulty bulb, but as if the concept of light itself was struggling to maintain its definition. Colors bled into one another, greens becoming oranges, blues shifting to impossible ochres. The edges of the room softened, the corners blurring, the distinction between wall and ceiling becoming moot. My desk, a solid slab of mahogany, seemed to undulate, its surface rippling like disturbed water. I stumbled backward, overturning a chair, its legs splaying with a sickening crack that was swallowed by the pervasive hum. I fell to my knees, gasping, my lungs burning. The floor beneath me was no longer firm wood. It felt like a viscous, yielding substance, warm and slightly adhesive. I pushed myself up, scrambling towards the door, but the doorway itself seemed to stretch, distort, becoming a tunnel of shifting perspectives. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate drum. The air was thick with the metallic tang, now acrid and suffocating. Through the shimmering distortions, I saw it, or rather, I felt it. Not a shape, not a form, but an omnipresent presence. It was the signal, the correction, made manifest in the very fabric of my world. The walls of the family estate in region not on standard maps were not collapsing, they were unbecoming. Each particle, each atom was being rewritten, its fundamental properties shifting. The space around me was no longer three-dimensional. It folded in on itself, stretched outwards, became something utterly alien to my understanding. My body began to respond. My skin prickled with 1,000 tiny pins and needles, then a deep, aching throb. My limbs felt heavy yet simultaneously insubstantial, as if I were dissolving. I was no longer Marcus, the astrophysicist. I was merely a collection of particles, a fleeting arrangement of matter, caught in the current of an incomprehensible cosmic tide. My thoughts, once linear and rational, fragmented into a cascade of raw sensation. The fear was gone, replaced by a terrifying, profound awe. The final realization dawned, not as words, but as an absolute, crushing certainty that permeated my dissolving consciousness. It wasn't about destruction, not in the way we understood it. It was about reordering. The entity wasn't annihilating existence. It was merely adjusting the dials, setting a new baseline. And humanity, with all its intricate laws and cherished certainties, was merely a momentary glitch in its grand, cosmic equation. We were insignificant, an anomaly to be corrected. My last coherent thought was not of resistance, but of wonder. The family estate in region not on standard maps was gone, not shattered, but rewoven into a tapestry of impossible geometries and shifting colors. The air was no longer air, but a shimmering, resonant field, and I was part of it. My consciousness stretched, thin and attenuated, across vast, unquantifiable distances, feeling the hum of the universe as it was meant to be, not as we had perceived it.